This week in Bevy, rendering takes even more advantage of the retained rendering world that was merged into 0.15. Scene spawning, entity cloning, and entity disabling all saw progress this week, which is just more proof that the next release will be a big one yet again. Out in the wider community, we get a flashback to Advent of Code 2024 with Bevy-based visualizations for all of the puzzles, procedural audio generation for car engines, and 3D scan data being used. The This Week in Bevy site itself also got an update to Leptos 0.7 in preparation for some more changes coming soon. And first up, entity mapping and cloning. The recent relationships functionality put extra stress on the current entity mapping system, which 17.687 resolved by improving entity mapping and cloning, which are both closely related to scene spawning functionality. Components now have first-class mapping behavior and new attributes to go along with it. Next steps are looking to use the improvements to spawn scenes. And writing a shader module that can be distributed on crates.io and imported by Bevy users typically requires a manually initialized handle and using something like load internal asset. 17.384 introduces a weak handle macro, which now accepts UUIDs, making it easier to pick a number for that ID that doesn't conflict with anything else. I don't know about you, but I've been taking the numbers from the examples that I have and just kind of like changing one or two of them, so not the most unique process. And how to change the material on an entity in a scene spawned especially from a gltf asset is a question that is pretty common. And as of 17.677, it now has an official example in the Bevy repo that you can now point people to anytime they ask how to change the standard material in a scene. And 17.559 adds support for text shadow to Bevy UI. This is a basic text shadow implementation made by replicating the text with the offset and the color, but future implementations could support a blur radius as well. And through the 0.16 development cycle, I feel like UI has been getting small improvement, small improvement, small improvement, which will really stack up when it comes time to actually see what the full change set is in 0.16. And that moves us on to retained bins. A phase item, if you're unaware, is rendered as part of a render phase, which you can learn more about in the custom phase item example in the Bevy repo. And batchable phase items are stored in bins, which as of 17.698 are now retained from frame to frame instead of being reconstructed. This is performance work that builds on the 0.15 retained render world. Speaking of building on that retained render world, materials, or really pipelines, can be specialized to modify the render pipeline descriptor. As of 17.567, pipeline IDs are cached and only recomputed when necessary. This is being referred to as cold specialization. And in 17.555, improvements to the procedural atmospheric scattering implementation that recently got merged were again implemented, improving the look of the feature for 0.16. And building on default query filters, 17.514 introduces an initial disabled marker. This component is a first-party marker for entity disabling, which is effectively the feature that was implemented in default query filters. And of course, as always, Alice's merge train is a maintainer level view into active PRs, both those that are merging and those that need work. And with that, let's kick off the showcases with Standing Around. This is a day-night cycle with a character standing around near a fountain of magic in a curved, almost Animal Crossing-like world. And the next showcase is actually just a code block that was pasted its way into a Discord thread. This is a demo that forms a web server you can attach to any of your Bevy projects to serve files or do anything else. This is specifically using the Bevy defer crate with Axum. And we saw this graph exploration tool a little bit earlier in a different issue. This is an improvement to the Path of Exile 2 graph exploration that takes specific stats to form a desired build, as opposed to the initial implementation, which just showed every possible. And Varg, a love letter to the classic MS-DOS boomer shooter genre, got doors and some fake mirrors in this dev update. Following that up with some 2D leaves shaking on trees in this rainy top-down environment. And back over to 3D for live terrain generation. This is experimentation with the idea of live terrain generation in preparation for an earthbending style ability. And speaking of the earth, this is a tree mesh generation in Bevy, which is actually live on a web deployment if you want to go play with it. And a bit of a throwback back to Advent of Code 2024, this is visualizations in Bevy for all 25 days of Advent of Code 2024, often built exclusively with UI nodes, although in this one in particular, you can see some gizmo action. And Graka Games' debut title has been in a pseudo-stealth mode, but they've decided to start posting more dev updates. This is Splash Rats, and Splash Rats is a physics-based 2D co-op action game with liquid physics. Development is quite early, especially when it comes to the visuals, but mechanics and physics have had a decent amount of work. So I'm personally looking forward to seeing more dev updates. And next up, we've got 60 gigs of 3D scan data of a monster can. This is a CAD model that was made before making a lower poly version and baking the scanned texture onto the lower poly model. Our next demo is going to be a bit of a brighter screen. This is an input rebinding menu, which was originally made for a game and extracted into a standalone example for Bevy Enhanced Input. Hopefully between Leafwing Input Manager and Bevy Enhanced Input, we can get some really nice upstreamed input controlling. And then we've got Flight the Power, which is an entry to Donkey or Big Mode's 2025 Game Jam. Currently only a Windows download exists of this game, but web and mobile could be on the way after a refactor. And finishing off the showcases, we've got this new space game with some Heightmaps that progressed during the week to enable barrel rolls. And kicking off the crates this week is Bevy Lit with its 0.6 release. Bevy Lit is a 2D lighting library, and 0.6 brings the ability to use any mesh 2D or texture as an occluder, better performance using jump flood algorithms, and a new tint occluder to control whether occlusion areas should tint with the ambient light or not. And next up, we've got a collection of 2 crates. The first is Bevy WebView Rye 0.2, and the second is Bevy Child Window 0.1. Bevy Child Window provides a way to embed a child window within the Bevy parent window, which currently works on Windows and Mac OS, while Bevy WebView Rye added support for embedded HTML, which, combined with the support for Bevy Child Window, enables displaying a web view inside of that child window. This is similar to some experiments that have gone on in the Tori ecosystem, so I'm somewhat hopeful that the Rust community can land on a reusable abstraction for doing this sort of thing. And Bevy Mod Skinned AABB automatically calculates AABBs for skinned meshes. This is a community-driven fix for disappearing meshes, which are documented in a GitHub issue. And then we've got Bevy Behave. Bevy Behave is a behavior tree crate which does on-demand spawning for task nodes and uses observers for non-entity tasks. And finishing off the releases this week, we've got Bevy Replicon 0.30. Bevy Replicon is server authoritative networking for Bevy, and 0.30 introduces remote triggers, the API being similar to networked events. And somewhat interesting for the devlogs this week is an increase in activity on Blue Sky. This is Elevated Arcana, and specifically the ongoing daily devlog for Elevated Arcana. So if you would like to follow the progress here, follow them on Blue Sky. And finally, we've got something a bit educational for you. This is making a car engine sound with Leat, that's L-E-A-T, and Bevy. Leat is a pure Rust visual node-based data flow language that is capable of designing a patch, exporting it to files, and importing that patch into Bevy. The goal is to enable the creation of dynamic sounds and procedural music that reacts to gameplay. This video in particular covers creating and using such a sound to generate a car engine audio from the realistic car sim that we saw last week. And that's it for this week. As always, we have all of the rest of the PRs that got merged listed on the website. I hope you have a great week, and I will see you in the next issue.